What if I told you that your great-grandparents were tricked into funding the biggest financial scheme in modern history, and they thanked the government for it? What if the posters calling them heroes were actually advertisements for a debt trap that would echo through generations? And what if I told you that same trick is still being used on you today? If you want to uncover the financial secrets buried in history, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm the monetary archaeologist, and I dig up the money stories they don't teach you in school. Let's expose the truth together. Picture this. It's 1914. You're living in London or Paris or New York. Life is normal. Then suddenly, everything changes overnight. War breaks out across Europe, and within weeks, the entire world is pulled into a nightmare that nobody saw coming. But here's what most people don't realize about World War I. The real shock wasn't just the violence, it was the price tag. For the first time in human history, war became industrial. We're not talking about soldiers with swords anymore. We're talking about machine guns that ate through bullets faster than factories could make them. Battleships that cost more than entire cities. Planes, tanks, poison gas, railways to move millions of men. Every single day of fighting cost more money than entire previous wars combined. And very quickly, every government involved realized something absolutely terrifying. They were running out of cash. The gold in their vaults, the wealth of their empires, the taxes they collected, none of it was enough, not even close. Britain was burning through money so fast that economists estimated the country would be completely bankrupt within months. Germany was facing the same crisis. France was desperate. Even the mighty British Empire, which controlled a quarter of the planet, was about to go broke. So the politicians and bankers got together in secret meetings and asked themselves one crucial question. How do we pay for a war when we have no money left? They couldn't just print more currency. Well, they could, but everyone knew that would cause massive inflation. They couldn't raise taxes high enough because people would riot. They couldn't just stop fighting because they'd already committed everything. They needed a miracle. And that's when someone had a brilliantly evil idea. What if we don't take the money from people? What if we convince them to give it to us willingly? What if we make them feel good about it? And that's how the war bond was born. Now, bonds had existed before. Rich people and banks had been buying government debt for centuries. But this was different. This wasn't about selling to the wealthy elite. This was about convincing ordinary working people, farmers, shopkeepers, factory workers, to hand over their life savings. The challenge was massive. Why would a regular person give their hard-earned money to the government? They needed something more powerful than financial incentive. They needed emotion. In Britain, the propaganda machine fired up like never before. Posters appeared on every street corner, billboards, newspapers, church bulletins. Everywhere you looked, there was a message designed to make you feel something. One famous poster showed a sad father sitting with his children after the war. The child asks, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" The message was clear. If you didn't buy bonds, you were a coward. You were letting down your country. You were abandoning the soldiers in the trenches. Another showed women dressed in black mourning their dead husbands and sons with the words, "Women of Britain say go." The implication? If you're not fighting, the least you can do is finance those who are. The campaign was genius because it didn't talk about interest rates or maturity dates or financial returns. It talked about honor, duty, sacrifice, love of country. In Germany, the Kaiser's government launched similar campaigns. They called their bonds Kriegsanleihen, which means war loans. Massive rallies were held. School children were encouraged to bring their pocket money. Churches told congregations it was their Christian duty. 8 different war loan drives were launched in Germany during the war. And in each one, millions of ordinary Germans lined up at banks to hand over everything they had. They genuinely believed they were helping their nation survive. But the absolute masterclass in propaganda happened in America. When the United States entered the war in 1917, the government faced the unique problem. Americans didn't want this war. It was happening on the other side of the ocean. Why should they pay for it? So the Treasury Department launched something unprecedented. They called them Liberty Bonds. Not war bonds, Liberty Bonds. Notice the difference? One sounds like obligation. The other sounds like freedom.
And they didn't just put up posters. They created a full multimedia campaign that would make modern advertisers jealous. Movie stars like Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks went on tour selling bonds. Baseball legend Babe Ruth signed bonds at stadiums. Boy Scouts went door to door collecting money. Schools held competitions to see which classroom could sell the most. There were Liberty Bond parades with marching bands, fireworks, and speeches that whipped crowds into patriotic frenzy. At one rally in New York, 500,000 people showed up. The most famous image from this campaign is probably Uncle Sam pointing his finger directly at you with the words, "I want you." Originally, that poster wasn't about enlisting, it was about buying bonds. Churches got involved too. Priests and pastors told their congregations that buying bonds was a moral obligation. Some communities publicly shamed anyone who didn't buy enough. They were called slackers. Even the language was weaponized. If you questioned whether bonds were a good investment, you weren't being financially prudent, you were being unpatriotic. You were questioning whether our boys should have bullets. And it worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The U.S. government raised over $21 billion through Liberty Bonds. That's roughly equivalent to $6 trillion in today's money. Regular people, many who had never invested in anything before, handed over their savings. A factory worker making $30 a week would buy a $50 bond. A teacher would sacrifice months of salary. Families would skip meals to afford them. They did this because they believed, they trusted. They thought they were making a smart investment that would help them and their country. But here's where the story gets dark. These bonds promised to pay back the full amount plus interest after the war. Sounds fair, right? You lend the government $100, and in a few years, you get $100 back, plus maybe $5 interest. Except there was a catch that most people didn't understand. The bonds would be repaid in dollars. Not in value, not in purchasing power, just dollars. And between 1917 and 1920, something catastrophic happened. Inflation exploded. Prices in America nearly doubled. A loaf of bread that cost 5 cents before the war now cost 10 cents. Rent doubled. Everything cost twice as much. So when you got your $100 bond repaid in 1920, sure, you got $100 back. But that $100 could only buy what $50 used to buy. You lost half your investment. Not to a stock market crash, not to a scam artist, to inflation, to your own government printing money and devaluing the currency. And here's the cruelest part. The government knew this would happen. Economists inside the Treasury Department had calculated it. They knew that financing the war this way would require printing massive amounts of new money. They knew inflation would eat away the real value of what they owed. But they did it anyway, because from their perspective, it was brilliant. They got to fund the war without immediate taxes. They avoided riots and rebellion. And by the time people realized what happened, the war was over and it was too late to complain. If you complained, you looked unpatriotic. You looked like you regretted supporting the troops. The emotional manipulation extended even after the war ended. Britain's situation was even worse in some ways. The British government issued something called War Loan in 1917. It paid 5% interest and was supposed to be a safe, reliable investment. Millions of British citizens bought in.
Veterans used their discharge pay to buy bonds. Widows invested their late husband's pensions. It was seen as the patriotic and smart thing to do. But inflation destroyed those bonds too. By the early 1920s, the real value of those bonds had fallen by over 60%. Imagine you're a widow who lost your husband in the trenches. The government gave you a pension and told you to invest it in war bonds to support the cause he died for. You do it, and then you watch as inflation makes your savings worthless, while you struggle to feed your children. That was the reality for hundreds of thousands of British families. But the British government did something even more clever to avoid admitting the problem. They converted many of the short-term war bonds into something called consols. These were perpetual bonds, meaning they would pay a small amount of interest forever, but the original investment would never actually be returned. Think about that. You gave the government £100 in 1917 expecting to get it back with interest. Instead, they converted it into a bond that pays you £2 a year forever. You never get your £100 back. Never.
And Britain kept paying tiny amounts on these bonds for generations. The last of the World War I bonds weren't finally paid off until 2015. That's 97 years later. The people who originally bought them were long dead. Their children were dead, their grandchildren were collecting pensions, and the British government was still making tiny payments on a debt from a war nobody alive remembered fighting. Germany's story is even more tragic. German citizens bought war bonds enthusiastically. The government promised they were safe, backed by the strength of the German nation. 8 loan drives raised incredible amounts of money, but Germany lost the war, and the Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations. The German economy collapsed. To pay its debts, the government just printed money, more and more and more, and hyperinflation destroyed everything. By 1923, German currency was worthless. People used wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. The money you'd saved for years couldn't buy a newspaper. Those war bonds completely wiped out. Every single mark invested was now worth less than toilet paper. Families that had patriotically invested everything were now destitute. Their loyalty had been rewarded with total financial ruin. And here's the thing that should make your blood run cold. The governments involved knew the risks. They knew inflation was coming. They knew many of these bonds would never deliver real returns. But the alternative was losing the war immediately due to lack of funds. So they made a calculated decision. Sacrifice the financial future of their citizens to buy time today. The soldiers on the front lines were sacrificed in blood. The bond buyers at home were sacrificed in wealth. Both groups thought they were serving their country. Both were used as tools. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that was over 100 years ago. Surely we learned our lesson, right? Wrong. Because the war bond campaigns taught governments the most valuable lesson in modern economics. You don't need gold. You don't need real wealth. You just need people to believe. If you can convince people that lending you money is patriotic, moral, or necessary for their safety, you can borrow unlimited amounts. And you never really have to pay it back in full. You just have to manage the belief. When World War II came around, did governments say, "We learned our lesson, let's be honest about the costs"? No. They ran the exact same playbook. In America, they were called war bonds this time. Hollywood went into overdrive. Movie stars sold bonds in every film. Bugs Bunny cartoons told kids to buy bonds. Pin-up posters of attractive women encouraged men to invest. The campaigns were even more sophisticated, more emotional, more everywhere. And again, inflation ate away the returns. Again, ordinary people lost purchasing power. Again, the government got cheap financing by essentially borrowing from the future. But something important changed after World War II. The system became permanent. Before 1914, government debt was seen as a temporary emergency measure. You borrowed for a war, then you paid it back as quickly as possible. After 1945, debt became normal, expected, continuous. The United States went from being a creditor nation to running permanent deficits. The Treasury bond market, born from those Liberty bond drives, became the foundation of global finance. Today, U.S. government debt is over $34 trillion. It will never be paid back, ever. The system isn't designed to pay it back. It's designed to keep rolling it over, forever, just like those British consuls. And citizens around the world are still convinced this is fine, necessary, even good for them. Every financial crisis follows the same pattern now. In 2008, when banks collapsed, what happened? Governments borrowed trillions to bail them out. They told citizens it was necessary to save the economy, save your jobs, save civilization itself. The debt exploded. Who paid? Future taxpayers. You, your kids. During COVID, the same thing. Trillions in new debt, printed money, stimulus checks. And now, inflation eating away your savings, just like in 1920. Different crisis, same mechanism, same propaganda, same result. They don't call them war bonds anymore. Now they're treasury bonds, or infrastructure bonds, or green bonds, or recovery bonds. The names change, the emotion changes. Sometimes it's patriotism, sometimes it's environmentalism, sometimes it's public health. But the core scam remains identical. Convince people that giving the government money now is noble and necessary. Promise returns, then inflate away the real cost. You're not a bondholder, you're collateral. The real genius of the war bond wasn't financial, it was psychological. Before World War I, people saved in gold, land, and tangible things. They didn't trust government promises. After World War I, people were trained to see government debt as safe, as wealth itself. Today, U.S.
Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment on earth. The global financial system treats them as if they're better than gold. But what are they really? Promises from a government that's $34 trillion in debt and getting deeper every year. Promises to repay you in currency that loses value every year through inflation. It's the same trick from 1917, just bigger, more sophisticated, more invisible. And most people never question it because we've been conditioned not to. Just like great-grandpa who bought Liberty bonds was conditioned not to. Questioning it makes you seem unpatriotic, or ignorant, or crazy. The system works because belief works. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is that governments discovered something powerful during World War I. They discovered that emotional manipulation is more valuable than gold reserves. If you can make people feel fear, pride, duty, or guilt, you can make them finance anything. You don't need to force them. You don't need to rob them. You just need to convince them that giving you their wealth is actually helping them. And once that psychological switch flips, you can borrow forever. The war bonds of 1917 weren't just about funding a war. They were about funding a new relationship between citizen and state. Before, governments served the people. After, people served the debt. We still live in that system. Every time your government announces new spending and new borrowing, you're living the legacy of those propaganda posters from 1917. The posters aren't as obvious now. They don't show soldiers in trenches. But the message is the same. We need your money, for your safety, for the greater good. Trust us. And just like 100 years ago, the real returns are inflation, debt, and a future that's been mortgaged before you even get there. So the next time you hear about government bonds being a safe investment, or national debt being necessary, or borrowing for some new crisis, remember the widows of World War I who bought bonds with their husband's pension money and watched inflation destroy it. Remember the German families who patriotically supported their nation and lost everything to hyperinflation. Remember the American workers who skipped meals to buy Liberty bonds and got half their value back. They were told it was their duty. They were told it was safe. They were told they were heroes. What they weren't told was the truth. And that same silence echoes today. This is the monetary archaeologist, digging up the financial stories they buried for a reason. If this changed how you see the system, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's a lot more hidden history to uncover, because the past isn't past. It's just renamed.